Hi, friends. There have been some questions about ICE recently, so let's approach the subject of ICE and deportations from a purely biblical standpoint. And if we're wise, then we will agree with what God says. That's humility. Just agree with what God says. Let's start with some basic points. Number one, governments exist by God's decree. That's the first point. Governments exist by God's decree. He has delegated authority to rule. He separated the world, and he actually formed the borders of the world. So we can say, well, it was treaties and wars that created the borders. The Bible says that God decided where those borders would be. Acts chapter 17, verse 21 says, He made, this is God, He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands and territories. So according to that verse, God decided when all nations would exist and what their borders would be. Again, the point is, governments exist by God's decree. It's not God's will that men not live under governments, and He has put every human being underneath a government. The smallest form of a government is the family. And God decided how a family would be run, and then we can extrapolate that all the way out into nations. He has decided how nations would be run, and it's in His intention that even the leaders of nations would submit to Him. More on that in a moment. They should submit to Him, these delegated authorities. They should submit to Him as their ruler. A king, a wise king, or a wise president or chancellor or whatever you've got in your country, a wise one would say, I intend to govern by God's laws, and I recognize that I answer to Him. That would be shrewd. That's the kind of thing that David did, sitting on the throne of Israel. But they are free to rule as they think best, even if it's they want to please themselves with their rule. The rub will be that they're all going to answer to Him eventually. Receipts will come due. And that's like your business, your home, or anything else that any human has authority over. What you run, you will answer to the Supreme One about how you ruled. So that's how governments work. You're free to rule, and you will answer to the sovereign. That's by God's decree. So let's establish that, first of all, that governments exist by God's decree. Let's also establish that borders, as I've already said, are part of a government's purview, meaning God has allowed for the borders, let's say the borders of the United States, God has given an okay to that the United States of America's borders will be where they are. And that's part of a government's purview, meaning part of the authority of a government is the protection of its own borders. There's an important story. It's Nehemiah. You can read in the book of Nehemiah from chapter 1 to chapter 7. It's the story of Israel building a wall to protect its borders. This is such a given biblically that when we speak of something like watchmen on the walls, you've probably heard that if you've been around the Bible for any amount of time or church life, watchmen on the walls. We know what that means. It means that there's a national agent who is guarding the walls of a territory or of our country and is ready to either fight or to sound an alarm if anyone tries to breach the nation's border. That's not controversial in a biblical worldview, that a nation has borders and that the protection of one's borders is upright, it's righteous, and it's in line. So in the invasion of outsiders into the borders of a country is not to be tolerated from a biblical worldview. Let's move on to point number 3. Enforcement of laws are also part of a government's purview. It's not only is it part of their freedom that they can enforce laws, biblically speaking, we can see that it's God's expectation that they would enforce laws. This is one of the righteous things that a government can do, is enforce laws. So Romans 13 is a famous passage describing a government's delegated authority. And it says specifically that they have the power of the sword to enforce their laws. I'm going to jump to Romans 13, starting in verse 1. And I'm just going to read this passage to you. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now listen to the reasoning of why be subject to governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. That is, every authority that exists exists by his permission and sanction. And those which exist have been put in place by God. And of course, your first thought, it might as well as, wait, the bad governments too? Well, that's exactly what's being said here. Therefore, whoever resists governmental, by the way, do you think that in Paul's time, he's writing to Romans, that's the name of the book, they're under Roman rule. Do you think that Romans were righteous and trustworthy in all the laws they had and their enforcement of them? Well, no, it was a treacherous empire. And Paul is writing to Romans in Rome and says, whoever resists, this is verse 2, whoever resists governmental authority resists the ordinance of God. And those who have resisted it will bring judgment on themselves, because civil authorities are not a source of fear of people of good behavior, that is law abiders, but for those who do evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what's good. Abide by laws, and you will receive approval and commendation. For he is, talking about these appointed governments, he is God's servant to you for good. You might have trouble with that verse. It's there. It's Romans 13:4. He is God's servant to you for good. But if you do wrong, you should be afraid. For he does not carry, here it comes, the executioner's sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an avenger, yikes, who brings punishment on the wrongdoer and the lawbreaker. Therefore, one must be subject to civil authorities, not only to escape the punishment that comes from wrongdoing, but also as a matter of principle. And then it goes on to say, this is the reason that you pay taxes, because civil authorities are God's servants. That might be a tough pill for Americans to swallow, but there it is. Enforcement of laws are part of God's government purview. It says that they yield the sword, governments, with God's approval. Swords are not for hugging and for affirming you, by the way. They're for stabbing. They're for killing. We're describing a nation's right to fight and, yes, to kill, to enforce its own security, whether it thinks that those are law-breaking forces from within, or again, we're applying this to those who would be coming from outside. This is why Christians, for instance, would totally endorse Israel's right to defend itself from outside invaders like Hamas. We would totally endorse that for any sovereign nation, not just because we have a particular love for Israel, but we would endorse that for any sovereign nation, the right to defend oneself. So that would be people from inside that want to violate laws and overthrow a government, and those from outside. We would say they have a biblical right. Okay, we established government is by God's decree. Borders are part of a government's purview, and enforcement of laws are also part of God's government purview. Now, here's a tricky one. The Christian attitude towards foreigners or sojourners. I know that some of you want that to be first, but we have to put that thing inside of the context of God's approval and endorsement of governments. Now let's talk about the sojourner or the foreigner. What is that? Now we see in passages like Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 10, it exists in many places in the Torah, that we're to have compassion on outsiders. Let me just think about what that is. We're talking about lonely, familyless wanderers who, for instance, they want to honor God, but they don't have a Sabbath table at which to celebrate. So God tells his people, now there's somebody who's a traveler, they're a sojourner, they're passing through. They don't have a family with them. I want you to sit them at your table of worship and fellowship. If obviously, this is no duh, if they want to worship Jehovah God, then have them sit at your table, your Sabbath table, where you're worshiping Jehovah God. If they want to be part of a family that submits to Israeli decrees by God, well, you could bring them in and be welcoming of them. So there are those passages, but I think the modern believer, the modern liberal, and by liberal, I don't mean they vote for Democrats necessarily. I mean the liberal American that believes to their bones that one of the benefits of what we have received and the privilege that we have. Look at me, I'm sitting here in my sweater in this warm room, and I've got a bunch of electronics equipment that's expensive that lets me do this thing. There's a massive amount of privilege that has helped me be sitting here right now. We believe a liberal-minded, and I just mean that from a dictionary definition, a liberal-minded American believes that giving to the less fortunate is one of our responsibilities, and yes, a blessing of what we've received. We would agree with that for sure, but let's understand what is being talked about when in the Old Testament we see to have compassion towards a foreigner or to a sojourner. It would be an assumption for the Torah reader that we're talking about people who have come into this country as law-abiding refugees or travelers. They are in submission to local powers. We just saw that. Reference. So they're agreeing to our local laws, and they want to submit to our customs with regards to worship. I mean, that's a big deal. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody talk about that. So one passage that is often misused in this conversation is when Jesus is talking in Matthew 25. We love to throw around the phrase, the least of these, just take that little phrase and just throw it out. The least of these, isn't that the least of these? Whoa. You don't just get to use that phrase. Let's look at the whole story of what Jesus was saying. Jesus says, I was naked and you invited me in. When did we invite you in? Jesus said, well, we'll get to the answer in a second. I was hungry and you fed me. When were you hungry and we fed you? He says, I was an outsider and you invited me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was hungry, you fed me. When? And the answer to this whole question, this Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats, is that he says, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these my brothers, you've done it unto me. That is huge insight for us understanding what this parable means. Not just the least of these. You can't just throw out the least of these. Well, then that means the shrimpiest kid on the football team is the least of these. And if I am nice to the shrimpiest kid on the football team, then I've done it to Jesus. That's not what he says. He says, if you've done it to the least of these my brothers, you've done it unto me. Now, there's an open debate about what Jesus means by the least of these my brothers. Does he mean the least in the family of faith? Believers in Jesus, Jesus's brothers. By that definition, I am Jesus's brother, even though I'm from a Gentile family. I'm one of his brothers. And Jesus says, if you've done it for the least of these, that would mean those people that are part of the fellowship of faith in your local church, for instance, who have need, the widows, the orphans, those struggling financially. Do good for them. And Jesus says, you've done it for me. I take it as if you've done it for me. Or, this is the other side of the debate, when Jesus say that you've done it for the least of my brothers, does he mean Jews? Does he mean Israelis? If you would be a blessing to Israel and to Jews, those are his physical brothers, you've done it unto me. Now that's an open debate, and I personally think I'm not I, I'm not totally sure what he means by that, so I'm going to be a blessing to both of those groups. Here's what I know for sure he doesn't mean. He doesn't mean go find the dregs of society, whoever that is, whatever they believe, and however they act, and just give yourself to them. That's what that parable has often been turned into, and it's certainly not what it means. Jesus says, do good to the least of these, my brothers. So we could say that there's certain caveats to when the Bible talks about our relationship with foreigners and outsiders. We would have to say that they would be law abiders. They would be people of peace. I'm getting that from Luke 10, people of peace. You don't just walk into a new town and be friends with anybody. You're looking for people of peace. Who will receive the message? Who will let us talk about the gospel, for instance? These are people of peace. And we're assuming that there is some level of openness. That's about the best that I can say. Openness and warmth to the faith story that we're living out and that God is telling through us. So that I got to throw that into this conversation. Enforcement of laws, borders, governments, yes. What's our attitude towards foreigners and sojourners? Well, it is the caveats that I just described. So now is the big question. What is the church's attitude towards ICE? Very hot topic in the news. We see a clash happening between people who act like this is the Nazi Gestapo. When we see ICE enforcement happening, let me just say this about ICE. Let's give a little definition of ICE. ICE is a lawful, law enforced. I mean, the law allows for them to exist, and they're a law enforcing branch of the government. They are much like a national police force, but they have a specific job. ICE does. And it's not to make sure that you don't speed. There is a police force that makes sure that you don't speed. That's not what ICE's job is. They are a police force, and their job is to do immigration control. What do we think about the concept of immigration control as believers? We're all for it. That's my short answer. You've heard the long answer. Does a government have right to manage its own borders and who gets in and who must leave and who gets to be a citizen and who is expelled? 100%. Yes, they have that right. So does the government have a right to have a force that enforces those laws? Well, sure they do. That in any government has a right to secure its borders and to punish or expel lawbreakers. So if people come into the country and them coming into the country is against the laws of that country, or specifically something that we seem to be seeing a lot in Minnesota, which seems to be the middle of the heat map when it comes to these sorts of issues, is people who come into the country and explicitly say, we hate this country. We want to change this country. We want to overthrow this country. That's being said crazily by people who have government position in the state of Minnesota and other places. Okay, well, as a Christian, our worldview is that where God has put us, we saw this in Acts 17, where God has put us, it was by his sovereign will. So we are to support the government where we live. I know that you're thinking of caveats. I'll get to those in just a second. And those who disagree with that want to overthrow this government and don't believe in the principles of this government or have come in by illegal means, we're 100% for the enforcement of laws. And if your attitude is, well, someone's been here 20 years, so they kind of belong. I think the law would say they've been illegal for 20 years and they should have been removed at one point. And whenever justice happens, slow justice is painful. Nobody wants slow justice. We want quick justice, but we want justice. Let me just say on a personal note, this isn't about me, but just for the sake of explanation, my wife is from a Mexican family. Her parents were both born in Mexico. Um, we have lots of family that lives in El Paso on the border, and I just want to tell you, I told you I'm an old American Gentile. My family came over in 1700s. Okay, but my wife's family, these are legal immigrant family. They came in legally. It took a long time. It was trouble to become legal, and now the family proliferates in the United States. Her family is like many you've heard of before. Boy, are they lovers of America. They wave the American flag. They are specifically opposed to anyone who would wave the Mexican flag in the United States of America. It offends them as Americans. When you go through citizenship, you might know this. Um, you have to specifically declare that you no longer have allegiance to your country of origin. You have to declare, verbally make an oath, my allegiance is now with the United States of America. That happened with my wife's family. So those who would say we still have allegiance to Mexico, that offends them. They say, no, there's a mixed allegiance here. That person needs straightening out. That family, even the family that's on the border in El Paso, you know what they love? Strong borders. And they will say that people who come across borders illegally are, by definition, criminals. We don't want them here. We don't think that it's compassionate to let criminals come into our country, because any government's first allegiance is to its citizens. Then, in an area of plenty, wow, there's so much plenty for all of our people. There's so much security. We think that we could take in outsiders. That would be a reasonable way to handle things in your own family, for instance, and for a country as well. So I just want to borrow the equity from the family that I married into and just tell you what second generation immigrants would say, which is that they don't want open borders. They don't think it's safe. They don't think it's wise. They hate it, and they live right on the border. You would think, oh, they'll have open arms toward anybody that wants to cross the border in El Paso. No, that's not how they feel at all. They feel like we went through some pains to change our allegiance and become Americans, and we think that's the righteous way to do things. So I got to throw that out. So in short, I'm gonna make your caveats here in 1 second. We do affirm and support ICE exactly the way that we would support policemen or judges or school administrators. That is, they exist by God's delegated authority, and we're all for them. And I can say that with a little simple smile on my face, knowing that there's conflicts happening all over the place. Now, here's the caveat after I've said all that. The caveat is, as with any of the authorities I've already named, our expectation is that they would behave righteously. So we oppose, rightfully, we would oppose any policeman who themselves bend the law. We would oppose judges who show partiality. That's not justice. We don't want partiality behind the judge's bench. We want justice. We oppose school administrators who fail to run an orderly environment for learning and character formation. So we endorse ICE as an idea. It's an expression of government authority. And we watch critically to make sure is a strong way of saying it. We just want them to behave righteously. So we wouldn't call for the dissolution of laws or for the dissolution of a police force. We would call for reform where evil has come in, where laws are not being followed, where partiality is being shown. And we would call for the lawful punishment of those wrongdoers who use their platforms and authorities unrighteously. But our appeal is to lawfulness. And I just want to make this closing point that we live in an age where even law and law enforcement seems to get raised eyebrows from within the church, I just want to give a warning. That's not Christian for us to be against laws or lawfulness. I want to shock you a little bit just by reading you a passage which might be familiar. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and it's talking about end times. And it says the mystery of, here's the magic word, lawlessness. You're going to hear that word spoken repeatedly. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but it's restrained only until he who now restrains it is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one, the Antichrist, will be revealed, and the Lord Jesus will slay him with the breath of his mouth and bring him to an end by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is through the activity of Satan, attended with great power, counterfeit miracles and deceptive signs and false wonders, and by unlimited seduction to evil, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who are perishing, etc. It goes on and on. My point is, you don't want to be on the side of lawlessness or being against law. We are people of God's law, the Torah, of his teachings. We love God's law. This is reiterated throughout the Psalms. We love God's law. Oh, I love your law, God, and on it I meditate day and night. We are people of the law. We love righteous laws. If laws are unjust, we want them made right. But we're not people who hate law. We love law. And I'll say one final time, ICE is a lawful expression of a God-ordained government to deal with its own borders. I bless you as you consider these things.